Let's talk.
John Franc. Resistance. The Cours Franc poem from Bayonne to Berlin. The Cours Franc Pommiès, I believe, CPF, was founded on the 17th of November 1942 by its namesake, André Pommiès. It operated in southwestern France, becoming one of the largest and most important resistance units in the south. It is the subject of a new book by Paul StJohn Mackintosh. I think Paul can hear me loud and clear and joins me on the live now. Paul, are you hearing me?
Yeah, no, I can hear you.
Marvellous. Right, we're live, so please keep swearing to a minimum then as we go. Good morning, Paul. How are you? Where do we find you on the planet this morning?
Lyon.
Oh, I say. The headquarters. Well, I mean,
That's the gastronomic centre of France.
Yeah, you know. but also if you're talking about the Résistance, one place that you didn't really want to end up, because of course that was Klaus Barbie land, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. The Centre for the Deportation and the Resistance here is a terrific archive, and there are plaques everywhere dedicated to the victims of the occupation.
Yeah, and Jean Moulin and all that, and the great betrayal at the house, of course, in Lyon.
Yep. So, yeah, it's pretty much at the heart of that.
So, just in case you don't know, Paul, and then the listeners will be like shaking their heads, because I am that worst sort of creature, the armchair historian, and as you can probably gather, I've got something of an interest in the Resistance as well from that brief little war waffle. So, explain a little bit about why this is of interest to you, apart from the fact that you are obviously in La Belle France.
Well, in general, the whole subject, because I'm an anti-fascist, and with contemporary politics being how they are, I've got a lot on my mind, and consequently, you know, I've and also training as a historian, you know, basically started delving back into the origins of the ideology, etc. And being in La Belle France, of course, I've got the whole all the epics of the Resistance to study and write about.
And can we I just want to say as well, because again, people always, and I always say this when I have the great opportunity to interview historians, people go, why are you into history, Giles? It's dusty books and dead kings. Oh no, it's not, is it, Paul? Just explain why history is important.
No, because I hardly need to repeat the old cliche, you know, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it, which is exactly what is happening right now. I mean, Umberto Eco, you know, the famous Italian writer, Name of the Rose, etc., he was a survivor/victim of fascism, having grown up under Italian fascism, and he boiled the key characteristics of fascism down into about, I think it's 14 points. You know, these are the ways, basically, whatever it calls itself, whatever its label, whatever hat it wears, these are how you can identify a fascist. And most of the modern far-right movements tick pretty much all of the boxes. You know, they may miss one or two, but all the same. Mostly it's all there. This rank, open fascism out there right now, despite all the lessons of the past. And the lessons of the past are exactly what ought to teach us not to go there again. So, yeah, that's why.
Right then. Should we
not forget history? Because you can't get away from it, because you are history. It's happening all around you right now, every minute. So you better be aware of it.
I'm about to get out my tomato box and start shouting "No passerán" at anybody who comes past. But there we go. Right then.
Yeah, that's exactly what people should be doing. Fully down with that.
Right then. So, Resistance. Tell me, because now, Seth, when you sort of talk about the Resistance, if people don't kind of know the Resistance, they sort of think, oh, well, these are the guys who are helping blow up bridges around Normandy. Because again, our timeline of the Second War tends to go basically, oh yeah, Dunkirk, then it's allo, and then it's basically D-Day, and then it's Berlin, which obviously it's not. So, Explain why Southwest France is particularly important to the Resistance.
It's part of the other reason I like writing this stuff. It's all these great untold stories, because you see it from an Anglo-Saxon perspective. You miss out so many incredible stories and experiences. Anyway, Southwest France, basically, it's This for much of the early period of the war until November 1942. Basically, June, July 40 to 42, most of that area was under the control of the Vichy government, this rump state set up by Marshal Pétain as a sort of client/ally of the Germans, who occupied most of northern and just the coastal regions. And therefore, it's a bit of a different story down there, because obviously Pétain is more or less trying to ally with the Germans, although he doesn't go all the way. But there's a sort of underground, not exactly resistance, but setting up basically clandestine networks with the cooperation of the Vichy army, trying to establish some sort of independent foothold military base, just in case things turn around and they have to start, fighting the Nazis again. Now, it's low key and it doesn't happen much. There's not much activity, but definitely there's clandestine networks within the Vichy army that are laying the groundwork for future resistance. They're basically hiding weapons from the Germans, etc. Now, no real action takes place until the Germans invade the south of France and take over the whole Vichy area in November 1942. Until then, it's all low-key, nobody is doing much. The communists start kicking at, the communist resistance starts when Germany invades Russia. Before then, the communists aren't doing much. They like to take a lot of the credit for the early resistance, but fact is, they stay very quiet because Russia is fighting as an ally of Germany until 1941. So, 1941, the communists begin to kick into gear. The Vichy government is still, in theory, a client of Germany. That stays quiet until November 1942. Then the Germans invade, take over the whole of the Vichy of France. Yeah. That area of the southwest that was hitherto sort of semi-independent then becomes a full, German subject territory. And at that point, a lot of the Vichy army officers, military professionals who were formerly following orders from Vichy, decide, no, this is it, done, we're going to go full-on resistance. And they, at that point, become a resistance army.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because so explain to me a little bit about who the man is. So is it Pommiès? Am I pronouncing his name correctly?
Pommiès.
Pommiès.
And he was basically a professional army officer, although from the southwest, born in Toulouse. He's from a fairly. He's not like a lot of the aristocratic French military officers, especially in the high command. He was from a fairly low-key background. I think his father was a printer typesetter, something like that. Right. But he becomes an army professional. In 1940, he is serving when in the fall of France. He then becomes one of the sort of holdover, semi-retired officers in the Vichy army and continues to serve in the south. And when November 1942 comes, a lot of people officers like that have to make their choices. He chooses, we're going to go resistance. And he becomes the linchpin of this new resistance movement in the southwest. So
how does it operate? Because I'm just thinking, of course, I'm just thinking Italy, because obviously Italy is fighting with the Nazis until obviously Mussolini is overthrown, then reinstated, then Germany basically invades the rest of Italy, and and throws most of the Italian troops into the bag. Basically, they get sent to to work camps. How does it operate with the Vichy then? I mean, do they just say, okay, they've got a little more? They're not so hard on the Vichy because they haven't actually sort of turned tail, as it were. They've just been assimilated, almost like the Borg, if you like, into the German structure.
A lot of them have sort of nominally retired. They've got a reserve officer status. A lot of those people, they're not bagged by the Germans. They just get wrapped up. They, in Pommiès' case, get a cover identity, get a new job,
right,
and continues to the new. And then a lot of them are off in these weird work camps that the Vichy regime instituted. They're off in forests doing things like charcoal burning because the Vichy regime decided this would be good for young men because that way they don't turn into communists if they send you out for a bit of health and education in the open air. Yeah, it's that, that kind of bullshit. So...
Because there's nothing your Marxist hates more than fresh air and physical activity. We prefer to be lurking in the back with their copies of Das Kapital.
Clearly the way to deal with this problem. Anyway, so there's quite a few of the army echelons and nominal resistance are often these work camps and sort of semi-hiding out there. It gets full-on clandestine pretty quickly, right, with, at proper, because basically at that point, those army high commanders have decided not to go along with a basically passive collaboration that Pétain and Vichy continues with. They go into, they either go off to London to join up with de Gaulle or continue a sort of semi-independent existence from London and start their resistance network, which Pommiès becomes a part of. And so he is effectively the commander in the southwest for the army network as opposed to the communist network and various other networks. Because
the resistance with the communists and that you see this again, if you say resistance to most people, they think beret, stripy shirt, submachine gun. That's how, and it does, and they're all on one aim, but it's not, because there are various, as I said, I mentioned Jean Milon, who is there's
a lot of competing stuff going on, and particularly the communists have this rep for doing big, high publicity events where, resistance things where they don't care too much about blowback on the civilian population. Yeah. Their attitude is that if the Gestapos and the Germans start cracking down on locals and shooting people, that just radicalizes the population.
Yeah.
The resistance, Corps Front Pommier and the units like them are much more focused on military and strategic targets. They're the ones that are really doing things like blowing up bridges, blowing up munitions factories, sabotaging power lines, basically stuff that has a military value instead of being big on publicity.
And presumably because they've got the training and the organisation and everybody knows what they're doing rather than being led by idealism, as it were, they're a damn sight more effective in the operations because they're not,
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's still bloody difficult. The body count is high.
Yeah.
And it's grueling from November to 1942 to about August 1944. There's this constant war of attrition with the Gestapo and the Germans, and also the remnants of the Vichy milice, these collaborationist pro-fascist militias.
Because the milice are quite a piece of work, aren't they? I mean, these are people who, but ladies and gentlemen, Paul is shaking his head with the sort of disgust I haven't seen for a very long time. I think you and me are the same about the milice, because there are some pretty awful, some dreadful people in the milice.
There's a lot to be disgusted about on the Nazi and the fascist side. One reason why it's so good to write about this stuff, but the militias, they're especially obnoxious because, they're traitors, basically. They're continuing to ally with the fascists again, and with the Nazis against their own occupiers, against their own people. And they often do particularly atrocious stuff, especially because essentially they are increasingly a hated minority within the broader community. So their attitude becomes increasingly the broader community is the enemy. So they, happily murder, massacre, torture people.
And it's not a man only operation in the Middle East as well. There are some horrendous. I mean, we're not going to go down the Middle East rabbit hole, but there are some horrendous women as well, aren't there, in the Middle East? So you just think, good grief.
It's like, I mean, yeah, really. So the Corps Franc Pommiès is up against them as an opposite force as well.
Now, I'm talking to you from Spain, and Hispano Sucia leapt out at me because that is, of course, the famous. Well, people would say, "Oh, that's the famous Spanish car maker." Not in the 40s. Is it popping out sort of nice automobiles for well-heeled aristocrats? What's the story behind the factory there then?
Oh, there's a local. Basically, there is a local Hispano Sucia. It's not the biggest coup that the Corps Franc Pommiès bring off, but they do basically. There is this factory there which they blow up, and it's basically it was making aircraft. At this point, it had been co-opted by the fascists. It was making aircraft engine parts for the Axis.
Yeah,
so obviously at that stage, it's no longer turning out luxury cars, it's turning out aircraft engines and aircraft engine parts.
And the important... I suppose the important thing is if you get rid of that on the ground, you don't have to commit resources and men in the air.
Quite so. I mean, this is attrition. It's not going to bring the war to an end with one colossal victory, but it's important nonetheless. It degrades the Axis war machine progressively. Which, if you're a small resistance unit, it's a pretty big bang for your buck.
Yeah. So tell me about, because, I mean, is there a point where it all turns? Is it because according to the notes that I've got, 12,000 combatants to support D-Day landings. These aren't people landing on the beaches. Presumably they just rise up and create havoc and basically turn Toulouse into a, we're not going anywhere near there at the moment.
Yeah, no, they are busy basically trying to impede as much as possible the Axis for the Germans from transferring forces up north to fight the D-Day landings.
Sure.
Obviously, it's getting in, you're doing all you can to sabotage railways, sabotage roads, bridges, etc., to stop the Germans reinforcing reinforcing the forces on the ground, fighting the Normandy landings is a bloody important thing to do.
Absolutely.
However, this is one of their periods of highest attrition. It's also a period of the greatest ruthlessness by the Nazis, because this is when the SS divisions really get into their stride, committing all the atrocities on the way against basically anybody who gets in their way as they try to get to the north to fight the Normandy landings.
Indeed. What's the relationship between André Pommiès and de Gaulle, because it all changes. Because de Gaulle, once the landings are successful and they've pushed back, they've got through the bocage and they're making de Gaulle is front and center. He wants French troops to take Paris back, obviously, and then he wants France to have a major role in the push to Berlin. I mean, and he's de Gaulle. I mean, he's not going. It's not the Rainbow Coalition, is it, Paul?
However, that said, the Gaullists, the official, the inverted commas official army resistance movement, this comes somewhat late to the game because obviously de Gaulle has been, doing his bit since 1940, and therefore it takes them a bit of time to be bedded down in the broader resistance machine. However, the one led from London by August, September 1944, obviously they're now de Gaulle's taken over in Paris. They're basically the Republic has formally, in Gaullist eyes and in Gaullist terms, been reconstituted. And at the same time, you've had the invasion of southern France.
Operation Dragon, yeah?
Yeah, Operation Dragoon. Yeah, this is the one that basically starts rolling up the south at a great rate, a great speed. And Corps Franc Pommiès basically joins in with that because Toulouse at that point, by that time, it's basically, this is where the glorious cocktail of resistance movements really is frothing in Toulouse at this point.
Right.
It's been taken over by Spanish Republican refugees who are they're most of them, understandably, have got a fairly strong communist heritage since they've all, come over since the Spanish Civil War. They are busy, basically when the corps from Pommiès units start arriving in Toulouse, the first they encounter basically Spanish Republican resistance asking for their credentials and their papers. And so there is a bit of a mix-up in authority in Toulouse at this point. So de Gaulle, not wanting this to get out of hand, sends down essentially a delegation to take control in the name of the Republic in Toulouse and essentially restore Republican authority and legitimacy in the...
Fascinating.
They decide the best way to deal with this problem, all the free French resistance units running around. He decides the best way to do it is basically combine them into this big column to go drive up. This is where the from Bayonne to Berlin momentum really kicks off. To start this column of resistance units to drive up from the southwest to Paris, to the sort of Burgundy area, to the northeast. So they pull them all together into this big column, which the corps from Pommiès military experience pays off because they've got the best logistics.
Sure.
And they are really able to get ahead of all the other crankier units, like the communist ones, to join the fight in the south, in the northeast, and to continue the push, basically, to push the Germans entirely out of France.
Yeah.
And so they get involved in a lot of the battles in the south, in the northeast that are happening at this point, having done this basically big drive up to the sort of Dijon, Burgundy area in just a few days.
So are they linking up with Patton's stuff? Are they getting in the way of Patton? He's carrying on? Because he's coming through pearl handles, firing off left, right, and centre.
They're sort of in parallel rather than working, completely. They basically hook up with other Free French and the French divisions that are have come into France by this stage, and they are pushing together alongside other units that are basically still combined from other free French resistance, which honestly is still a little bit chaotic, but engages in some pretty ferocious battles against the Germans in the east. And basically by around October, November, they have joined up with everybody else along the final lines that the French and the Americans established, which is basically pushing the Germans out of France everywhere except the northeast mountain area, the Vosges, the Alsace-Lorraine, etc., because that is still mountain territory, very obviously very difficult to penetrate, and also October on, you get Arnhem, etc. So for one reason or another, logistics, Montgomery's strategic masterpiece at Arnhem, etc. The whole momentum of the Allied advance more or less stalls, and the corps from Pommiès then beds down for a particularly brutal winter battle in the and in Alsace-Lorraine, where they are fighting in atrocious winter conditions. There's minus 30 degrees centigrade. You have the poor squaddies are basically up on the top of mountains in the cold, in rock, slit trenches, where very shallow, and the only way they can stay warm, stay alive, avoid frostbite is basically bed down three at a time, with the two outside keeping the one in the middle warm, and have to switch places. So this goes on for basically a couple of months before they're finally able to break through in Alsace-Lorraine around January, February, and by this stage, the Gaullist High Command have decided we can't have all these irregular Free French units running around, many of them still full of communists, and therefore we've got to regularize them into proper military.
Yeah.
And for most, the procedure is basically they send them notices saying you've got to leave your unit and be reincorporated as an individual. The Corps from Pommiès is one of the few that has established such a reputation for professionalism, for unit integrity, for competence, for military discipline, that they decide this is practically the only one that we can reconstitute as a whole.
Yeah.
So that's what happens. It becomes a regular regiment.
Paul, I could talk to you about this until I don't know, Bastille Day, because this is absolutely brilliant stuff.
Anyway, if we're running out of time, that's the regiment that basically gets to occupy Berlin as the first French infantry regiment to occupy Berlin in the French zone.
And this is the first, but that amazing. Again, this is a movie, Paul. This is an absolute movie, isn't it? I mean, we don't.
Great stories that you don't get, that are still waiting to be untold. It's to be told. It's extraordinary how many epics like that there are.
The book is called Résistance. It's the Corps Franc Pommiès. I still get it wrong, Pommiès. From Bayonne to Berlin. It is by Paul StJohn Mackintosh. Listeners, you can order it via our own virtual bookstore. Go on to TRE.radio. You will see a fine body of men on the front page there. Click on that and it'll be winging its way to you.
Oh, yeah.
Paul, if people want to... by the way, is he the one sort of front with the beret rather than the flying cap? Is that him? Is that your man?
I can't remember it. I don't think it's just one of the Pommier units.
Right, perfect. If people want to find out more about you, because this isn't the only thing you do, where's the best place to find you online, Paul?
Just paulstjohnmackintosh.com.
Brilliant.
You know, I've got... and with a name like that, you're not going to have much trouble finding it.
The book, honestly, Paul, that is an outstanding piece of work. I love this. I love having conversations like this because there is so much the Second World War than just A Bridge Too Far or Kelly Heroes or whatever you like.
Yeah, and it's so pertinent to modern day.
The book is called Résistance, the Corps Franc Pommiès from Bayonne to Berlin. It is by Paul StJohn Mackintosh. Paul, it's been an absolute honour to speak to you this morning.
Pleasure. Great to talk to you as well.